Hi, it's Keith Townsend from the CTOadvisor.com with hopefully a quick hit video on Microsoft's Ubuntu on top of Windows announcement at Build 2016. It's being promoted as Bash on top of Windows, but it's really Ubuntu on top of Windows. Is this a VM? Is this some type of trickery? What is it exactly? Is it a container? What exactly is Bash or Ubuntu on top of Windows? So what Microsoft is using is basically the same architecture they've used for Windows over the past 20 years plus years, especially when we're talking about the NT kernel. If you've been around NT for some time, you might remember Windows NT 3.5.1 and Windows NT 4.0. There was always this concept of a POSIX or a Unix subsystem. Microsoft, like every other major operating system, has a kernel space. That kernel space is pretty protected. You don't write applications directly to the kernel. There's over the years, Microsoft, to make the operating system even more stable, have provided overlays or interfaces into the kernel. Same thing in Linux. When you look at most Linux distributions, the kernel itself is protected. Most Linux distributions are the same core Linux open source kernel with value add on top. If you take a look at Ubuntu is going to be the same core Linux kernel that's available in every other operating system and every other Linux operating system with the Ubuntu binaries on top of it. Microsoft is taking advantage of these two similar architectures. In Windows, we basically have two subsystems when we're talking specifically about Linux on Windows. We have our Win32 subsystem that our traditional Windows applications run, so our DLL based applications and .com and .exe apps all run within that space. In this Linux on Windows, Microsoft has now created a Linux subsystem. And that Linux subsystem is providing all of the interfaces into the Windows kernel needed to run Ubuntu binaries on top. So when we take the Ubuntu binaries, so the Ubuntu ELF basically binaries, and run that within the Windows Linux subsystem, all the calls from Ubuntu gets processed by this Linux subsystem and passed on to the kernel. So you actually get Ubuntu. You're not getting Linux on top of Windows, but you're getting Ubuntu ELF on top of the Linux subsystem, which is basically, for lack of a better term, emulating the Linux kernel. So those kernel calls that Ubuntu user space would usually make into the Linux kernel is being answered by these Windows subsystem calls, which go into the kernel, which eventually process the request from that user space binary set. Hopefully this quick video has cleared up some confusion about whether this is a VM container. No, this is native Windows application technology just being implemented via this new Linux subsystem that Microsoft has almost always kind of had in their POSIX subsystem, which supported Unix apps, which I don't know if anybody ever really used. That's it for this episode of CTO Advisors Tech Talks. I hope you enjoyed it. Visit us on the web, thectoadvisor.com, and subscribe to the podcast, thectoadvisor.com/podcast. Talk to you guys next episode.